Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it's another book review. Been a while since I've done one of these, but this is an audiobook I've listened to a couple times with a couple months span in between, and I felt, you know what, I should actually review it this time. I reviewed the film adaptation that Martin Scorsese did for Netflix a couple years ago, so I figure, since I mentioned in that review I hadn't read the book, so I don't know how faithful of an adaptation it is, I figure now it is. This, of course, is the book written by Charles Brandt as the memoirs for Frank the Irishman Sheeran. I Heard You Paint Houses. And the title apparently comes from the first words that Jimmy Hoffa supposedly said to Frank. Now, before I get too far into it, just a reminder, if you want to support the channel, both the Patreon and PayPal links are down below. If you want to do continuous support, go to Patreon route. You'll gain access to videos early, and you'll be able to suggest topics for future videos. If you want to do a one-off request or some one-off support, go to PayPal route. Either way, your support is appreciated. Now, the full title of this book includes a little subtitle, Frank the Irishman Sheeran and Closing the Case on Jimmy Hoffa. This book was published in 2004. And it is very, very controversial because there's a lot of people that dispute what goes on in there. And in fact, there's even a article by Bill Tonley called The Lies of the Irishman that dispute it. And there's even some people that were in the mob that dispute it. Like if you type in mafia YouTube channels, there's one. I'm not going to name drop the guy in here, but he's really disputed it and says he knows who does it. But obviously, like some of the other stuff that he knows about from his time in the mafia, he doesn't mention it, which I'm going to say right here, that could mean one of two things the way I look at it. Either he knows he does it and doesn't want to name drop it because the person is still alive, or name dropping it could lead to him being either discredited for other stuff, or attempted to discredit it, depending on how you slice it, or he could get whacked. And the other thing, and this is where I'm leaning a little bit more towards it, even though he's no longer in the life, he doesn't like rats, as he says, and even though Sheeran's is more like a confession and not a traditional rat, he doesn't like what Frank told all this stuff in the book, and is trying to discredit him and being loosey-goosey about what he says he knows. So there's that. And of course, The Lies of the Irishman, like I said, I haven't read the article and I haven't read the other stuff, but I know people do discredit it. Now, I will say, having listened to this a couple times, if Frank is doing a good amount of lying in this book and elaborating and embellishing stuff, on top of the stuff he actually did, he's a pretty good embellisher. Now, I know there's a whole thing about eyewitnesses being the least, not supported, the least reliable form of evidence and all that jazz, which will come into play with some of the people that Charles does interview in here. But the way it comes across, it's very, very convincing. So whether you believe it or not, or just take it as a embellished piece of fiction, it's still an entertaining read and gets you thinking, which is what I think some of the best books are supposed to do. And either way, it makes for good source material for a book, as Martin Scorsese saw. Now, the version I listened to was the expanded version with the updates that Brandt included for years later. Now, the main part of the book is Charles detailing Frank Sheeran's life as Frank tells it, adding stuff in here and there to elaborate on it. Either stuff that Frank did not dictate during their interviews, or stuff that Charles decided to throw in there to add context to what the next part of Frank's monologue is going to go into. And the audiobook that I listened to is narrated by Scott Brick, and I have to say he does a pretty good job narrating it, because when he's speaking as Charles and when he's speaking as Frank, you can really tell. He doesn't really change his voice a lot. It's more the cadence of his words, a little bit in his tone, but you could feel the switch. And you're like, okay, that's Frank, that's Charles. And of course the wording, because when it's Frank, it's pretty obvious it's Frank, and when it's Charles, adding more prose behind it, like let's say if someone's taken a primary source, publishing it, and then adding little footnotes, it's like that. Now, if you've only seen the movie, you've never read the book, more or less the plot of the movie is what the book covers. It does add more stuff, like Frank's life before he meets Russell Bufalino. a lot of that is elaborated. His childhood, why he left home, joining the army, his first sexual escapades, coming home, how he got the job with the truck, a lot more stuff there. The fact he actually did get fired from running the truck, which the movie kind of skims over that, but showing that it actually happened, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. A lot more of his life with Russell, and it elaborates a little bit more on the stuff we do see, like the murders, the death of Whispers, killing Joe Gallo. Jimmy Hoffa's covered more or less about the same, but given it's a book, there is a lot more detail, a lot more inner monologue related stuff in there, and we really do feel Sheeran's guilt about his involvement in it, which I know this is the part you're really going to be like, yeah, is he really feeling it or not? And I'm going to put this, even if he's not the one that directly pulled the trigger and was only involved with luring Hoffa away to get him into a false sense of security, that's the type of guilt that's really going to nag on you if you're involved in the death of someone that you figure a close friend. And even if he wasn't there, but he knew about it, that guilt would be there. I mean, Frank was a Catholic. I mean, I've brought up Catholic guilt and all that before in other videos, mainly jokingly when I've been talking in the Everybody Loves Raymond reviews, but here there's some of that, his faith and all that. And even though he has killed people before, I mean, he killed people at war, even though some of the stuff he does talk about, leading the prisoners away, killing them and after they've dug their grave, technically I think that would be a war crime, but at that point in his life I don't think Frank has much to worry about getting convicted of any war crimes. Although if they really wanted to nail him like they did for other stuff, I could see them going after him. I mean, they got Al Capone for tax evasion, so that should tell you if they really want to get you, they're going to get you. And of course killing everybody else for Russell and everyone else, like I mentioned, Gallo apparently, Whispers, he has no qualms about that. But then with Frank going with Jimmy is like, yeah, but there's a difference, like something you view as a job and something you're like, oh, I feel it right there. Now the amended stuff at the end adds some extra post original publication stuff. Like some of it is stuff that Charles could not include in the original publication due to the fact that the people were still alive, stuff he could only loosely talk about but had to do it in a roundabout way or else Frank would pull the plug. He included stuff like who the third ring belonged to. It belonged to Russell's underboss, who was a relative who was passed away by that point. It included a little bit of intel into how they got Frank out of prison on his parole, which is loosely covered in the movie. I mean, we see he's in prison and then he goes on parole, and it's like, yeah, it's probably for his health, which it is, but they don't really go into it. They mention that Frank did do some stuff during that time that, like, yeah, he could have gotten his parole revoked, but like having a meeting with a bunch of current mob people. It does go over how the mob changed in the time period of the 80s into the early 90s, which I think is interesting that they gloss over that in the movie, but I can kind of see why Martin Scorsese would decide not to, because he already covered that time period in his other gangster classics, Goodfellas and Casino. It would feel like ground that's already been tread over. I mean, some people called The Irishman a little derivative, considering it's Scorsese doing it, even though I would argue against that. But if they were to cover that ground, I could see that argument having a little bit more weight. So just like going over it, yeah, it would make sense. But it's interesting that the book version does go over that, and it kind of picks all things together. And at times, while I was listening to it, I'm like, stuff he mentioned, like, that'd be at the same time that blah 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 turned state's witness, at the same time the casino thing was going down, and how back in the day being a mob boss was a good thing, and now as it was put in the book, you can't even give the position away, which, given all the RICO stuff that's happened, makes sense. It's about Charles finding the Hoffa house, going in there, having the stuff DNA tested, but of course because of the years and all that, it's almost impossible to prove that it's Hoffa or they came from that. That goes into also part of it, whether you're going to believe the book or not. Like I said, I haven't read Lies of the Irishman, so I don't know how well that counters the argument and all that, because I'm going more on this. But it's nice little added details to throw in there. They do mention how they dispose of the body, supposedly, cremation, and then it's just cremains, and no one will ever know a thing. Going more into his life with his daughters. They elaborate a little bit more. This is in the main part of the book, but I should have mentioned this earlier. They mention a little bit more about Frank's relationship with his first wife. In fact, with how the movie presents it, they kind of do stretch the truth a little bit, but you know, you only got so much time in a movie. He did not leave his wife directly for the second wife. He had actually been separated her for a while, but due to the fact they're Catholic, the whole thing about it being a sin to divorce, he did not want to marry his second wife until she basically put her foot down and said, I want to get married and I want to have a family. Alright, he went there, presented it to him, and alrighty, they divorced. And he married the second one. And had their last daughter. And with the daughters, I find it interesting how he describes that all the daughters have a different reaction to dealing with the FBI. And it depends on when they were born in his crime life, where the oldest ones are oh, hi, how are you? But the youngest one is I don't got a word to say to you, coppers. The amendments at the end of the audiobook also cover Charles meeting with Martin Scorsese, Robert De Niro, and the screenwriter, and talking about the book. Talk about stuff that were not in the book, and any of them, and stuff that they could throw into the movie. It's probably some of the minor details, like Jimmy and his relationship with the older daughter and the ice cream. All that stuff. I mean, some of the stuff they throw in there by Jimmy is in the book, like the whole thing about watermelon. And the whole thing about a jug of wine in there. There's a lot of funny anecdotes involved in the relationship with it, which is why you do believe that Jimmy and Frank were friends, and adds to Frank's guilt in that. Whether or not they were actually this close friends, or that's just how Frank perceived it, and to Jimmy they were more acquaintances. Because there's the whole thing there. It's perception is reality. And as a wise man once said, most of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view, which is another way to look at this book. This book could be the truth from Frank's point of view. From someone else's point of view, it could just be a bunch of lies, or yeah, he's just twisting it. But from Frank's point of view, it could be that. Like I mentioned earlier, even if he did not go and pull the trigger directly himself, maybe Frank feels like he did kill Jimmy because he didn't say anything and all that. He's just cross loyalties. There's a lot of that there. You definitely do feel a lot of that coming through Frank's words, and of course the narration helps with it. It definitely is worth a read. I mean, I have the audiobook, but one of these days I do want to get a hard copy of it so I can look over it more and can highlight some interesting passages if I ever want to do a more in-depth review of this, like an analysis of chapter by chapter and all that, especially after I read Lies of the Irishman. If you have Audible, it definitely is good because it is an engaging audio read. I mean, if you listen to audiobooks like I do on your way to and from work, or when you're going places like Vegas or other long drives, definitely worth it. Just a little FYI, I do have the audiobook version for the book that this movie's adapted from. So that should be one down the pipe. It's a lot shorter though. So that should be fun. And without having notes, there's not really much else to go into. Just if you're a fan of the movie, you probably will be a fan of the book, especially with all the added stuff thrown in there. So go to Audible, go to Amazon, order it. Definitely comes with the Mar stamp of approval. And just get this off the top right here. If you guys don't believe Frank and all that, that's cool. Just don't try to go, oh, you're an idiot if you think any of it in the comment section, because any kind of comments like that will be automatically deleted. And if you are anyone in the mob life or know somebody in the mob's life and you try to pull that card, well, you guys all know my thoughts on that card. I'm not going to talk about it here other than being don't be an Eric Bischoff. Till next time, guys.